When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's hammer home some anti-armor ideas by looking at the Warhammer. The Warhammer is a bludgeoning tool designed specifically for combat. Similar to regular hammers, the Warhammer consisted of a handle made of wood or metal and a head generally made of iron or steel. Historically, warhammers varied in size based on whether they were intended to be used by infantry or cavalry. Shorter warhammers were primarily used by cavalry, measuring only 0.6 to 0.9 meters long. Infantry, on the other hand, preferred longer warhammers, which measured up to 1.8 meters. An important thing to note here is that many of these longer warhammers are more so polearms than warhammers, such as the poleaxe, lucerne hammer, or bec de corbin. While regular hammers have been used as impromptu weapons since the ancient period, as I discussed in my light hammer video, the warhammer didn't really emerge until the mid-14th century. This was, in large part, due to the rise of plate armor on European battlefields, which required anti-armor weapons to overcome. While swords and axes had a hard time getting past mail or plate armor, hammers were able to repeatedly batter an armored opponent. The force behind these strikes could be brutal, and while they wouldn't kill an armored opponent outright, they would weaken and exhaust them with each concussive blow. This video from the Smithsonian channel sums it up best.
What the Warhammer does is it doesn't try and break the armor, it sends the power through the armor, and blow after blow after blow would weary a man. But that's just blows to the body. What would a weapon like this do with a blow to the head?
Such blows can break a man's neck, possibly leave him stunned or worse.
Once sufficiently battered, a weakened enemy could be finished off with a dagger or with a spike commonly added to the other side of the warhammer's head. While direct sources are sparse, it's believed that warhammers began as infantry weapons, used on and off the battlefield as a popular anti-armor weapon. As I stated earlier, these weapons were generally longer, used with either one or two hands. Early poleaxes, or pole hammers as they were called, were featured prominently in fighting manuals and duels throughout the 14th century. Their effectiveness against armor led warhammers to be adopted by cavalry as early as the 15th century, with the added momentum of a charging horse only making the warhammer more deadly. While the introduction of early firearms in the 15th and 16th centuries led many armies to dispose of their melee weapons, the warhammer remained popular in Eastern Europe until the early 18th century. The warhammer's popularity transcended the battlefield, however, and they've become iconic of medieval and fantasy warfare. They were so popular, in fact, that they became the namesake of the Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000 tabletop wargames. Other than that, warhammers are a common weapon option in medieval or fantasy gaming, being featured in games like Chivalry, Dark Souls, and Dungeons & Dragons. In D&D, the warhammer is described as a type of hammer designed for the purpose of combat. Measuring around half a meter long, warhammers were designed to be usable in one hand, but that design required martial training to wield properly. Present since 2nd edition, the warhammer of older editions cost between 2 and 15 gold pieces, weighed between 2.2 and 2.7 kilograms, and dealt either 1d4, 1d8, or 1d10 bludgeoning damage depending on the edition. In 5th edition, the Warhammer costs 15 gold pieces, weighs 0.9 kilograms, deals 1d8 bludgeoning damage when held in one hand, and deals 1d10 bludgeoning damage when held in two hands. With all this in mind, the Warhammer of 5th edition mirrors the effectiveness of other 1d8 versatile martial weapons. Like the longsword, it's affordable and flexible with how it can be used. For those rare tables that track carry capacity, the Warhammer is also 0.4 kilograms lighter than the longsword and 0.9 kilograms lighter than the battle axe, all while providing the same potential damage through bludgeoning strikes. Its damage type can also come in handy against certain monsters like skeletons, but my take has always been that mundane damage resistances, immunities, and vulnerabilities aren't used enough in 5th edition to make a noticeable difference. With that being said, if my character's not using a longsword, they're probably using a Warhammer instead. My go-to for paladins or clerics, the Warhammer is a perfectly adequate weapon option in D&D. It's so good, in fact, that without any other properties or features added to the 5th edition weapons, the Warhammer actually starts to overshadow other options like the flail. Just like the longsword, I don't believe that some weapons should be the meta option in the game, as that makes equipping weapons kind of a false choice. Players will choose the best option for their character, and weapons are no different. Rather than make the Warhammer worse though, I'd like to focus on improving all the weapons of D&D so that they each have their own semi-unique reasons to be used. Rather than leave the Warhammer as is, I'd like to examine some unique features we can add to it that will give it more of a personality. So, while we're not necessarily fixing the Warhammer, let's look at some fun ways to spice it up. My first suggestion would be to allow it to stun enemies on a critical hit. Historically, the Warhammer strikes against armored opponents were often meant to stun or weaken them rather than kill them outright, though a good hit to a vulnerable area could still be lethal. To reflect this in-game, if a character rolled a critical hit with the Warhammer, it could inflict the stunned condition, which incapacitates an enemy, causes them to fail strength and dexterity saving throws, and causes further attack rolls against the creature to have advantage. While adding this feature is objectively improving the Warhammer, and it's already a really good weapon, this would only occur on critical strikes, adding extra rewards to an already rewarding moment in the game. My second suggestion on how to give the Warhammer more personality is to allow users to shove with the weapon innately. While the longer polearms that took inspiration from the Warhammer often had spikes on the end, the one-handed cavalry Warhammer was generally flat on top. In Pathfinder, this general idea grants the Warhammer the shove trait, which allows characters to shove with the athletics skill even if they don't have a free hand. While shoving in 5th edition isn't exactly the most overpowered attack a character can make, it does allow them to move enemies 5 feet away or knock them prone, which can make it easier to reposition on the battlefield or knock them off a convenient ledge. Considering how flexible the Warhammer is already, granting it this additional ability gives characters who use it even more versatility on the battlefield, opening up new options to control how your enemies move. My third and final suggestion for how to spice up the Warhammer is to allow it to swap between bludgeoning and piercing damage types. Historically, most Warhammers had a spike opposite the hammerhead, which would be used to puncture through armor once their target was sufficiently battered. Granting Warhammers this versatility between damage types matches how they were used historically, and gives players even more flexibility against a variety of enemies. Now, with that being said, this essentially invalidates the Warpick as a weapon option, and I'm very hesitant to remove things from the game when 5th edition is already so streamlined. However, when it comes to the war pick, I just don't see enough justification for keeping it as a separate weapon in the game, even with the suggestions I made last week on how to improve it. Of all the suggestions I'm putting forward, this one is the one that I'm least confident with, so make sure to let me know what you think about this down in the comments. With all of that being said, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to spice up the Warhammer in D&D. If we left it alone, the Warhammer would remain a really good martial weapon option, bludgeoning baddies wherever they may hide. But if we implement some or even all of these suggestions, we can help make the Warhammer more distinct from other martial weapons with added flexibility and control on the battlefield. With that, we come to the end of today's video on the Warhammer. A badass bludgeon, the Warhammer is a really great weapon option for characters who want a bludgeoning version of the longsword, and fits well into any paladin or cleric's arsenal. That being said, it's stepping on the toes of some other martial weapons, so by adding some more features, we can keep it fun and viable while giving it a more distinct personality and role in combat. However, what I want to know is, what do you think of the Warhammer? Do you think it's fine as it is? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward, or did you have your own ideas on how to improve the Warhammer in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Alt-Roll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Alt-Roll, you can visit our Ko-fi to leave a one-time or recurring donation, and make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. However, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.